everyone. I'm Ioana. I'm the CEO of GameAnalytics. We did this analysis a few months ago, when China really started to turn into a tier 1 market. So I've been with GameAnalytics for almost 3 years now, and in the beginning you could really see there was the US and some countries in Europe, and then everybody else. But what happened really in the past 2 years is that we've really seen China become a tier 1 market for all of our publishers, with eCPMs that are sometimes higher than the US. And because of that, we also started receiving a lot of questions about how players in China behave. It's quite well known that they're somewhat different, but nobody knows exactly what that means from a practical point of view. How should games be different when you launch a game in China? And how should monetization be different? We're going to look at that today. And first of all, about the scale of the data you analyze, so you guys understand kind of exactly what it is. In the meantime, we've actually added even more players, but at the time when we did this, we had almost 900 million monthly active users. Since it's past 1 billion, we had about 70,000 active games and almost 60,000 game developers. I think right now, other than Google and Facebook and Twitter, we're probably the biggest data source in the mobile space, definitely for gaming. So it is truly a data set that nobody else would probably really be able to produce, and nobody else is really talking about. Yeah, which is why we feel it's actually so important to bring it to developers and to people like you guys. What we're going to talk about today, is in principle how you should monetize in China. How players are different, but what that means for you. How you should monetize. Is it IAP? Is it ads? And what you should expect when defining your monetization strategy. Because truly, we do see some differences in behavior, and you'll be able to tell that if you just measure China in the same way that you would measure the West, you're probably going to come up with some unexpected results. So we're going to start from something kind of more basic differences, and we're going to go to more specific, and it's going to be from kind of more common to less common. So in terms of genre preferences, we look at App Store genres. Honestly, this is not that interesting. So in terms of the actual genres people prefer, they're about the same. A few of them, we have a couple of inversions, but it's always a few percentage points of difference, barely an entire percentage point. It's not we can't tell from just looking at the App Store and the games people download if there's really a difference in behavior. But where we do start to see a difference in behavior is in how people spend. So we look first at ARPDAU and then at ARPU, and there are differences in between the two. So for ARPDAU, average revenue per daily active users, if you monetize with IAP, so you're more in the core casual games, kind of more traditional mobile game side, we do see that the rest of the world has a slightly higher ARPDAU than China, by about 25%. When we do these numbers, the thing to know is that we look at the median. Now, for those of you who haven't done math in a while, the median is actually the middle point in a distribution. So if you have 100 points, the 50th point would be the median, right? And that allows you to truly split in what's higher than the middle and what's lower than the middle. Because if you just take an average and you have a player that pays ginormous amounts of money, it will skew the average for everybody else. So when we do these numbers, just remember that we truly try to look at something that is representative and is not just an average that can be influenced by outliers. And the interesting thing here, what you see in the second part, is the impact of actually holidays and Chinese New Year. So around the middle of that graph, we see Christmas starts, and then kind of the ARPDAU stays high until about Chinese New Year. So December to, let's say, March is a great time to monetize with in-app purchases, probably better than the rest of the year, better than, for instance, what you would see in the summer. That is important because if you do launch a game and you launch some in-app purchases, then on one hand, it may be better to do campaigns and to try to make more revenue then. On the other hand, that's not really representative of how the game will do overall. So at some point during the year, you may start to see your LTV drop, either your combined LTV for both or your LTV from just IAPs. In China in particular, there's a clear difference for Chinese New Year, and that is that spike that you see there. There is a little drop before the actual Chinese New Year. I think there's a school holiday right then, so you can see kind of the impact of more people probably playing that are not necessarily converting. But at the time of the actual holiday, when everybody has time off, like people with money, you can see that it actually goes up. Another interesting thing that I took from this is that, if you launch a game before the holidays, before a holiday like that, it will probably definitely earn more in that period than it would afterwards as well. So the same kind of observation. Don't jump to conclusions. Wait to see how it does over a longer period of time, because the behavior can be quite different. Okay. Now, because ARPDAU is really a factor of, out of my daily active users, how much are people paying, but also how many people are converting, we tried to look at, is the difference coming from the amount that people pay, or is it coming from the fact that fewer people overall are paying proportionately? And we do see kind of a similar difference in conversion. So it seems like there is, out of the total volume of people, we have lower conversion in China by about 20%. However, there is very high variance. We see a somewhat weekly pattern. Again, we see that spike for Chinese New Year. But what I would say, and what I like to highlight for this graph, is that if you look at the amount of smartphone users in China, it's over 700 million. Whereas in total for the US and Europe, you have about 500 million or a bit less, a bit over 500 million. So you have, even though conversion is slightly lower, you have much more population, like a much broader base of users in China. So the absolute numbers that you can get in terms of your total revenue can still probably be a lot higher. And again, that's the US and the whole of Europe combined, right? So to get all that entire volume from one single language market is quite rare. The only other comparable tier 1 market is the US, and that's 3 times smaller than China. So definitely, if you're going to have a very strong strategic play in the US, it's probably worth trying to invest even more in finding the sweet spot for IAP in China, because the total potential volume is a lot higher, even though you may see a slightly lower conversion. Okay, this is where, for me personally, it starts to get very interesting, because we look at player spending power. So, okay, conversion is lower, but if conversion is lower and ARPDAU is a bit lower by the same amount, then player spending power should be similar, and this bears that out, right? But the interesting fact is that it's not actually only similar, it's about the difference is in favor of China by about 10%. But there is also a clear there's much more variation, right? So when people spend more, players in China spend a lot more than players in the US or in the rest of the world. So it seems like it's really worth finding those players who are willing to do purchases. And potentially the value of this data, or of identifying those players accurately, is more so than in the rest of the world. And I was personally, I don't know if I should be surprised by this, because, there is definitely a change in Chinese society where it's becoming, there are many people who are becoming very affluent and so on. And again, the population is very large. But when I first saw it, this came as a surprise to me, that the revenue per paying user in China is higher than in the rest of the world. I would say, for those of you who are wondering about what our data set actually is, hold on. Most of our data set is from tier 1 countries, so Europe and the US. So even though we're treating it as China versus rest of the world, I would say that, what you're looking at is really more like China versus the US and Europe, which is why we kind of treat it like that as well. Okay, so we also looked after that to see, well, when somebody spends, is it that they spend more money at once? Is it that they make more transactions? What actually happens? What explains the difference between the fact that, paying users in China make more revenue? And we do see that actually players in China spend more frequently. Once somebody has converted, they tend to convert, they tend to spend at a higher rate to make more transactions. The difference is only about 4%. But like I said, I think it's still a significant difference. And if you look at if in the other graph we had 11%, it does seem like both are a bit higher. It's that they also spend once somebody has converted, they tend to spend a bit more money, and they also tend to spend a bit more often. So again, they seem to be paying users in China seem to be very, very valuable users. I would also say it's something that we intuitively know about Chinese gaming culture, but it's true that it applies in mobile as well, right? Not just in desktop, for instance, and that the numbers bear this out. It's not just kind of something that intuitively makes sense, but it seems like it's something that we can prove with data. And now this is my favorite graph in the whole presentation because it really shows, the question is why do people spend more? Why do they have more transactions? And it seems that players in China spend about 50% more time playing than users in the rest of the world. I think this is the single biggest difference in any graph that we have. And it really shows that obviously, they spend more because they are more engaged. Once they engage with a game to the level where they play, they also play it a lot. So again, they can be very, very valuable users, those tier 1 users. And then we looked at, okay, but do they just play multiple times a day? Or is it that when they play a lot? And what we actually found is that the number of sessions is lower. So they would open the game fewer times, but when they would play a lot more. So it's probably even more important than in other markets to truly get the player hooked and get them in the game, because once you have them, then they will spend the time and they will invest in the game. And again, the difference here is about 36%. However, the difference in how much time they spend is about 48%. So I would say that still definitely, even if you count for fewer sessions, playtime in China is higher than it is in other tier 1 countries. And then we looked at, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of how they interact with a specific game? Are they likely to play more games, or are they likely to just play the same game over and over? And the interesting thing here is that you can see a seasonal pattern everywhere in the world, right? There is people play more at the weekend. We know this to be true. This is borne out in with GameAnalytics for as long as I've been here, with the only exception being the holidays. But what is interesting in China is that the difference is so much higher. In the black lines that you see, there's a 10% difference. And I would say that's generally what we see as well. So we consistently see this, with traffic at the weekend being about 10%, 15%, sometimes higher than traffic during the week. But in China, it's something like double, triple than it is during the week. And again, this is very important for, I feel, a particular reason, which is if you know that people are going to come back at the weekend and that's when they're gonna spend the time, that's probably when you want to bring them into the game. You probably want to target your ad campaigns and your UA strategy around bringing people in when they have the time to play. The other thing is that probably if you haven't made them come back at the weekend, they're probably not going to come back at all. So in order to prove this, that we're at the end, you can see that the pattern does get suspended in Chinese New Year holidays. They play a lot more, so they become a lot more like players in the rest of the world, where there is a holiday, they'll just play a lot, they'll come back to the game, they'll have time to cycle for multiple games. Right. So in order to kind of dig into this further, we looked at retention, right? So we just looked at stickiness, which is how many people are here today that were also here in the past 30 days. And we want to see how this ties into, well, how long do I need to bring people, how long do I need to keep people in my game to make my game a habit for them? And we look at day 1 retention, which already is a bit lower by 18%, so almost 20%. That is a very significant difference, right? That is the difference between retention day 32% retention day 1 and 40% retention day 1. One will get you published, one won't, right? So it does have a very significant impact on how players react in the game. It may be that to publish a game in China, or if you do want to publish your game in China, you want to expect that your retention will be a bit lower in the beginning and you want to be prepared for that and you want to be prepared to work on that a bit, perhaps soft launch even before. I want to say soft launch before you go to a publisher, but actually with the regulations, that's not really possible. But when you go to a publisher, you really want to kind of be aware of this. And if you do get lower numbers with them than you're used to, you want to stick at it and you want to kind of set expectations from the very beginning that if you need to come up with changes for 5%, 8% difference in retention and absolute numbers, you should have ideas for how to fix that immediately and to start A/B testing those ideas as soon as possible. Because the numbers are likely to be lower. But the interesting thing is, and this is my second favorite graph of this presentation, is that retention day 7 is a lot lower by 65%. So essentially, this kind of bears out what we saw in the previous graph, where if they don't come back at the weekend, they're gone. Like you lost them. Any UA strategy that doesn't bear out like a good day 7 retention in China will just fail, most likely, because the cost of the users will be sufficiently high and you won't be able to monetize them. We see this in other markets as well. When we analyze kind of the difference between day 1 retention and day 7 retention, we find that day 1 is the most likely metric to yield a false positive, right? People can like your game on the second day, but get super bored by day 7. This happens quite a lot nowadays with kind of super simple games coming up in hyper casual. But maybe it will drop by a bit, but maybe you can still work on the game. But in China, because of this kind of weekly pattern, people either play at the weekend or they don't play. And unless you truly manage to get there, you're very unlikely to have a commercially successful game. However, because of what we discussed about before, once you get there, people play more and so on, it is probably worth spending more time to fine-tune the game than you would spend in a more predictable, more kind of consistent market, right? So you probably want to be prepared to run more experiments, invest a bit more in soft launching, because it might take you a while to find this exact sweet spot of people don't come back during the week but come back at the weekend, whereas with a regular game in the West, it's much more like if they tend to come back, they kind of come back during the week as well, right? So it feels much more all or nothing in the Chinese market. Okay, so what can you do now? I think I've mentioned some of these already. But essentially, if you demonetize with IAP, there are players out there. There are tons of whales in China. Like, you really need to, try to experiment and find those players, because there are more of them than in other markets, because the population is bigger, but also because they tend to behave even more so like whales. They tend to spend more time, spend more money more often. Secondly, if you do monetize with ads, you may struggle in the beginning. You may have a rocky start until you find kind of that repetitive, addictive pattern. But again, it's worth keeping at it, because once you do, people will stay in your game longer and they will be less likely to switch games, right? And you also want to be prepared to adapt your game design to the fact that if your game is snackable, but it's really made for, a certain amount of time for people to play 3 levels and then they run out of content, then it may be that that's why they're moving away, right? It may be that the way you kind of engineered your core loop makes them bored at a longer session time. So you really want to consider how that affects your game design as well, and how you can use that insight to update your core loop and increase your retention for this market. The third one is for economies of scale. The way actually I like to say this is like, if you're spending a lot of money to bring players at Chinese New Year and you're happy because it seems those players are coming back, you're probably actually never going to make your money back on those players. It's the time that when people spend the most, it's still good to spend, but it's good to spend if you have a good core loop and those players are going to come back the 7th day after the holiday is over. If you haven't perfected that yet, the moment the holiday is over, they will disappear and never come back again, right? So if you either monetize them super aggressively, which is also an option, right? It's like, go in, 20 ads, they kind of hate the game, but whatever, it's a holiday. Or you really spend the time to do your testing beforehand and keep them for the long term. And that's really up to you. Like, both can work. It really depends if you are launching kind of a bit of a throwaway game and you're just experimenting, or if you do want to kind of have a more core game that you keep alive forever. It's more a game as a service, live ops, and so on. So that's it.